It is my absolute pleasure to be addressing this august audience today. So switching gears from what we've heard before, we will be talking about urban mobility and the power of bikes, motorbikes, two-wheelers. I am Aishwarya. I am the head of research at OLA Mobility Institute. We are an in-house social innovation and policy research think tank established by the ride-sharing platform OLA. We are a young team of urban planners, developmental scientists, sociologists, policy professionals, economists, and more who are developing knowledge frameworks at the intersection of mobility, innovation, and public good. I'm an MSc in sociology from the University of Oxford, UK. I've been associated with the mobility industry for close to a decade now. I used to run my own startup in Chennai, and I've been associated with OLA for the last 4 years now. With that, let's get started. What I hope to unpack today or unbundle today is to walk you through how mobility paradigms are changing the world over and what the India story is. Talk about how India is a two-wheeler country, how bike taxis are India's new shared mobility frontier, and why India should legitimize bike taxi. In all of this, what is India's advantage and how can it go about doing it? So the world over, the ubiquity of smartphones has ushered in a new era of mobility. Mobility today ranges from ride-hailing, ride-sharing, and car-sharing to bike-sharing, smart parking, on-demand delivery, clean tech, electrification, autonomous vehicles, multimodal solutions, mapping, telematics, vehicle-to-X communications, infotainment, fleet management, insurance, and more. All of this is driven not just by consumers changing preferences, but also by risk capital that is getting pumped into the mobility ecosystem. As of early 2019, we had as much as $60 billion that were invested in mobility startups across the globe. On-demand mobility unicorns are as many as 15 in number globally. World's leading unicorns are in fact mobility companies. What is also fueling this change, fueling this growth, is the changing consumer behavior, like I mentioned a little while ago. So traditionally, if we look at the mobility choices we've had private vehicles in the form of two-wheelers and four-wheelers, which were provided to us by automakers and auto dealers. Public transport in the form of buses or metros, given to us by government agencies or city authorities in general, and intermediate public transport in the form of autos and taxis provided to us by independent businesses and owners. What is changing today is that there is an increasing availability of data, there is a new concept of vehicle ownership, and there is a concerted ecosystem-level regulatory push to reduce vehicular emissions. All of this in order to help ensure that the Indian transport sector is decarbonized and we lead a future towards sustainability. At this juncture, it is important to understand the mobility opportunity that we have. The mobility opportunity that startups around the world have are twofold. One, at the moment, we have passenger kilometers ranging roughly 35 trillion kilometers a year. This is only going to double by the year 2050. Similarly, the per capita commuting delay today is around 50 hours a year, which too is expected to double by 2050. And it's these challenges that we hope mobility startups would be addressing, and it's these challenges that the paradigmatic shifts of mobility too would address. What do customers need? Today's mobility consumers require real-time mobility information and planning, digital payment interface, single payment interface, and connected transport modes. All of these are offered by a robust mobility integration infrastructure in the form of connected multimodal personal and public transport modes, rapid transit stations, e-commerce facilitating online transactions, and finally and most importantly, data, information, insights, and analytics. This change witnessed both by consumer preferences that are getting changed, the new age businesses that are emerging in the mobility domain, are all testimony to the fact that a new form of economy is getting created, that of sharing economy, that of collaborative economy. We see this not only in the mobility domain, but also elsewhere, in the real estate or shared spaces in the form of OYOs and Airbnbs, in media streaming, in content sharing, in the form of Netflix and Hulu. Goods and services too are getting shared in the form of startups such as Rentomojo, Flyrobe, and lastly, the mobility sector itself. I'd like to concur with the vehicle manufacturer that we've quoted here. This person seems to say, quote, "Don't assume we're always going to be in the car business. The notion is you don't have to have ownership of a car. You just want to get from point A to point B," unquote. And that is true, isn't it? Today, the ownership of the ride is replacing the ownership of the drive. It doesn't matter if I have access to a vehicle of commute. It doesn't matter if I have ownership of a vehicle of commute. All that matters is that I have access to it. So this is something that the automotive industry too is well aware of. So the automotive industry studies say would get their revenues not from the traditional sources such as financing and aftermarket, but from data and connectivity and on-demand mobility services that they are going to provide to new age customers. Let's now therefore deep dive into the India scenario. Mobility is the next economic revolution and India is the new frontier. I repeat, mobility is the next economic revolution, India is the new frontier. India is well poised to ride the wave of shared mobility. One, it has extremely low per capita ownership of personal vehicles compared to other geographies. It also has a population that is heavily reliant on shared mobility. Shared mobility is highly utilized in India. Public transit, including taxi cabs and autos, non-motorized transport, account for 55% of all trips in the country. With low car ownership too, India is positioned for a mobility transformation. This, ladies and gentlemen, on your screen is a scene that is quite common across the country. Majority of the cities today face this kind of a situation where most of the citizens are stuck in traffic. Bengaluru, for instance, which is India's tech capital, comes to a halt every single day. It's also been pitted as the most congested out of 416 cities surveyed across 57 countries. And this is what India needs to address. India needs to urgently address and solve for the issues of congestion. By doing so, India would be embracing urbanization and creating a path towards global and inclusive economic growth. At this juncture, it's important for us to pay our attention to the humble and all-pervasive, all-ubiquitous two-wheelers. India, we argue, is a land of two-wheelers. Nearly 63,000 two-wheelers are sold every single day. 81% of the automobiles sold in India are two-wheelers. Therefore, two-wheelers contribute extensively to the GDP. 72.4% of the registered vehicles on India's rural and urban roads are two-wheelers. Two-wheelers provide access to the hitherto underrepresented communities. Two-wheelers are relatively easy to own and use. It caters to users of all age groups, of socioeconomic profiles, and to individuals across genders. This is also reflective in the patronage that two-wheelers have received at the hands of Indians. There are as many as 102 two-wheelers for every 1,000 persons in the country, as against 22 cars per 1,000 individuals. 1 out of 2 households in big cities and developed rural areas own two-wheelers, and 1 in 3 Indians use two-wheelers for their daily commute to and fro work. Two-wheelers are primarily a utilitarian choice for Indians rather than an aspirational or a lifestyle choice. At the same time, we believe that there is still a huge opportunity for India to grow with its not just ownership but also usage of two-wheelers. When we compare India with other Asian countries, we see that a country like Indonesia has 281 two-wheelers for every 1,000 persons. Thailand has 291 vehicles per 1,000 individuals, whereas India's only got 102 two-wheelers for every 1,000 people. The census too recognizes that the penetration of two-wheelers is increasing, and that is an opportunity that's in front of us, not just for the automotive sector, but also for the mobility economy as a whole. We also argue that two-wheelers are an engine of growth. Today, two-wheelers are able to deliver affordability and convenience, are giving a boost to the on-demand and hyperlocal economy of the country. Two-wheelers are also a new vehicle of job creation by helping not just the mobility of goods, but also the mobility of people in the form of bike taxis, bike pool, bike rentals. Two-wheelers are able to create a huge number of jobs for India. That brings us then to the story of bike taxis itself. Bike taxi can be regarded as India's new shared mobility frontier. We've had, back in 2015-16, a large number of startups emerge in this space. As many as 40 were reported in 2017 as operating bike taxis across different cities. Major cities of adoption were in fact Gurgaon, Hyderabad, and Bengaluru, where there is a large chunk of young professionals who have given patronage for these kinds of services. The current brands that continue to operate are the likes of OLA, for instance. OLA Bike currently operates in over 200 cities and towns with 300,000 driver partners. Uber Moto, which is claimed to complete over 150,000 trips a day across 30 cities. Rapido, yet another bike taxi company, present across 100 cities, over 100,000 partners, catering to a huge customer base of over 1 million. And Baxi, one of the first bike taxi companies, which has now pivoted to a hyperlocal delivery startup. The reason we wish to share these numbers is to showcase the potential that exists in the sharing mobility ecosystem, and particularly so in the case of bike taxis. The journey of bike taxis, despite huge uptake from consumers such as us, has also been fraught with many ups and downs. When we trace the road to legitimacy of bike taxis, we see that the earliest bike taxi was operated in Goa as early as 1981. The state of Goa then legitimized this by 1991. The ministries of road transport and highways, as well as the housing and urban affairs, have also recommended that the sharing of bikes be used and promoted across states. So the National Urban Transport Policy, for instance, which was released in 2004, gives sort of precedence to the mobility of people instead of the mobility of vehicles. And this kind of primacy that's accorded to people movement is at the core of the mobility goals that our cities are adopting today. So following a lot of the central government push as well, several state governments across the country have legitimized bike taxis. They've created bike taxi rules and regulations and policies. And as many as 14 of them have done it, and as recently as February 2020, we've also had Meghalaya that's legitimized bike taxi. There are very many reasons why India should legalize bike taxi. Just a second, please, sorry. So we argue that bike taxis are allowing you to maximize asset utilization and services. This would naturally promote and increase the remunerative opportunities of individuals associated. We also see that bike taxis are ideal to promote first and last mile connectivity, and thereby they reinvent public transportation. Bikes, by virtue of sharing, are also able to move people away from ownership and usage of personal vehicles. This would naturally then decongest cities. Bike taxis and bike shares in general offer convenience through deliveries. Bikes also allow us to zip through traffic at 30 kilometers per hour, which is the documented average speed of bike taxis. We would be able to beat traffic. Also, bike sharing, by reducing the reliance on personal vehicles, reduces the demand for individualized parking spots as well. And this is important because land is a scarce resource, and cities would be in a better position now to optimize the utilization of land that they hold. Lastly, all forms of sharing of bikes in the form of bike taxi, bike pool, bike rental, and so on, promote entrepreneurship of varying sizes and kinds in India. There is plenty of evidence, not just within the startup community in the Indian context, but also globally too, of the positive impact of bikes. So Belgium, for example, has a huge population of two-wheelers, and they've also been thinking about opening up shared mobility frontiers there. So a study in 2012 conducted by the University of Leuven found that if 10% of the drivers switched from car usage to two-wheelers, time spent in traffic would decrease by 40%. Similarly, if 25% of the car users switched, congestion would be eliminated entirely. So closer home in Indonesia, we've also seen that a startup like Gojek is able to positively impact and create a huge socio-economic impact on the economy. So Gojek is a startup that engages over 1 million driver partners in Indonesia. They're all plying on two-wheelers. They also have 250,000 merchants. So a study by the University of Indonesia in 2019 found that since its inception till 2019, Gojek alone was able to eradicate 15% of the total unemployment of the country. Similarly, Gojek was able to contribute USD 3.8 billion to the country's GDP in 2018 alone. In the country of Indonesia, MSMEs have gone digital for the first time thanks to the introduction of Gojek. And lastly, Gojek's also driven the participation of women in the workforce thanks to the plurality of services that they offer. That brings me to the concluding point and the concluding message, which is that India has a huge advantage as it heads towards becoming a $5 to $10 trillion economy. One, the new mobility market that India has is estimated to cross $90 billion by 2030. New mobility is on-demand mobility, demand-responsive mobility that is offered to you by technology-enabled platforms. These range from traditional vehicle sharing to P2P vehicle sharing, corporate sharing, dynamic shuttle, mobility as a service, taxi services, and more. So this is a huge opportunity that India has. Likewise, we've also been able to identify 4 levers that can be utilized to help India achieve the $5 to $10 trillion economy dream. One, we have increasing demand from consumers such as you and me. 2, we also have businesses that are catering to this new age consumer and are creating shared mobility and shared product services. 2, there is also increasing policy support. Like we saw, even in the nascent bike taxi space, we have a bunch of states that have come forward to support this new form of mobility. Similarly, the entire mobility economy benefits from the enabling policy environment that states and central government agencies are creating. Startups are also benefiting from reforms such as GST. 3, there is also increasing investment in this domain. We saw how globally $60 billion have already been pumped in. This figure is only growing. In India too, increasing FDI and private equity venture capital funding has become a norm. And for India, there is a cost advantage as well that's helping us attract these investments in the mobility sector. So all these 3 pillars or levers of growing demand, policy support, and rising investments create the mobility economy opportunity that India requires now in order to achieve the $5 to $10 trillion future pretty soon. So we have studies that show us that by 2030, India is definitely going to be a leader in the shared mobility space. This is also going to help us reskill our workforce, have a future of work that is not disrupted by technology, but that is enabled by technology. This is only going to give a boost to the micro-entrepreneurial blood that exists all across India, and a huge boost to the MSME businesses in India as well. So with that, we come to the end of today's presentation. We saw how shifting mobility paradigms are taking the world over, and that's true of not just global, that's true of not just in the global scenario, but it's true in India too. We saw how India is a two-wheeler country, how bike taxi is India's new shared mobility frontier, why India should legitimize bike taxis, and what advantage India is.